Picture this: you're sitting in the most prestigious military academy in the galaxy, surrounded by the children of war heroes, decorated generals, and legendary pilots from a dozen different species. The Krillian prince beside you has compound eyes that can track 17 targets simultaneously. The Vorthak daughter across the room can bench press a small starship with her 4 arms. The Zelani twins in the back row can phase through solid matter at will. And then, there's the human girl in the 3rd row. She seems ordinary. Painfully, almost embarrassingly ordinary. She struggles with basic tactical theory. She can barely lift the standard issue plasma rifle. During combat simulations, she hides behind cover while others charge into battle. Her test scores hover just above the minimum passing grade. Some instructors whisper she only got accepted because of humanity's recent admission to the Galactic Defense Coalition. Saracen appears to be everything the other species expect from humans: weak, slow, unremarkable. Just another example of why Earth's warriors could never match the legendary fighters of the old galactic powers. But here's the thing about humans that the galaxy is about to learn: we've been fighting wars longer than most species have had written language. And, sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in the room is the one nobody sees coming. When the Academy's morning roll call reveals that Saracen isn't just any random human student, but bears a combat codename that makes veteran warriors go pale and battle-hardened instructors step back in recognition, everything everyone thought they knew about humanity is about to change forever. Because the quiet girl who sits in the back of class and barely speaks above a whisper? She's the reason entire enemy fleets surrender at the mere mention of her callsign. She's the living legend who ended 3 separate wars before her 18th birthday. She's the human who single-handedly redefined what it means to be a warrior in the modern galaxy. And she's been hiding in plain sight the entire time. Welcome to the story of how one average human student reminded the galaxy why Earth doesn't just survive in the cosmic arena, it dominates it. The morning sun of Valoris Prime cast long shadows across the crystal spires of the Galactic Defense Academy as students from across the known galaxy made their way to the central amphitheater. The Academy, a marvel of engineering that housed the best and brightest young warriors from 47 different species, hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled military machine. Saracen walked among them, her small frame dwarfed by the towering Vorthak cadets and the sleek, predatory forms of the Krillians. At barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with unremarkable brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail and wearing the standard-issue Academy uniform that seemed 2 sizes too large for her slight build, she looked exactly like what most of her classmates assumed she was, a diversity admission who probably wouldn't last through the first semester. She kept her head down as she climbed the steps to her usual seat in the 3rd row, middle section. Not too close to the front where instructors might call on her, not so far back that it looked like she was trying to hide. Just perfectly, unremarkably average. The way she liked it. "Hey, Chen," called out Zyxth, a Krillian noble whose scales shimmered with an iridescent blue that marked him as royalty among his kind. His voice carried the particular mixture of amusement and condescension that had become familiar over the past 3 months. "Try not to fail today's tactical assessment too badly. Some of us actually want to graduate." Sarah glanced up briefly, meeting his compound eyes for just a moment before looking away. "I'll do my best," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the general chatter of students filing into their seats. Nearby, Fraka Ironarm, daughter of the legendary Vorthak General Gronder the Destroyer, let out a rumbling laugh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her massive chest. Standing nearly 8 feet tall with 4 muscular arms and skin like weathered stone, Fraka was everything a warrior should be according to galactic standards. Best might not be good enough anymore, little human. Word is they're thinking of implementing minimum combat efficiency standards. Wouldn't want the Academy's reputation suffering because of deadweight. Sarah nodded slightly, not trusting herself to speak. She could feel the familiar weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on her, some curious, others dismissive, all of them seeing exactly what she wanted them to see. The quiet human girl who somehow managed to pass her classes despite clearly being out of her league. The charity case who made everyone else feel better about their own abilities by comparison. As the last students took their seats, the massive holographic display at the front of the amphitheater flickered to life, showing the Academy's seal, a stylized star surrounded by the symbols of all member species of the Galactic Defense Coalition. The conversations died down as Commandant Veltar, a distinguished Solani whose pale blue skin seemed to glow with inner light, stepped up to the podium. Cadets, Veltar's voice carried easily through the amphitheater without artificial amplification, a testament to his species' natural vocal abilities. Before we begin today's tactical warfare seminar, we will conduct the monthly roll call assessment. As you know, this is not merely a matter of attendance, but an opportunity to evaluate each cadet's progress and potential placement in advanced combat specializations. Sarah felt her stomach tighten slightly. She hated roll call days. Too much attention, too many questions. She preferred the anonymity of regular classes where she could blend into the background and let others take the spotlight. Veltar activated his datapad, and the first names began to scroll across the holographic display. Alex Brightspear, Tactical Assessment Grade A-, recommended for Advanced Starfighter Pilot Training. A tall, elegant Altarian with flowing silver hair stood and bowed gracefully before retaking her seat. Her test scores in three-dimensional navigation were legendary among the student body. Koreth Bloodfawn, Tactical Assessment Grade A, recommended for Ground Assault Specialist Training. The Dracarian's reptilian features split into a toothy grin as he stood, his scales rippling with the deep red coloration that marked him as a natural predator. Even his classmates gave him a respectful distance. The list continued. Thraka Ironarm received her expected recommendation for Heavy Weapons Specialist Training. ZYXTH's scores earned him a place in the Advanced Strategic Command track. One by one, the Academy's elite students stood to receive their recognition, their future paths in the galactic military machine laid out before them like red carpets. Sarah found herself relaxing as the alphabetical order worked its way through the C surnames. Chen would come up soon. She would stand for her unremarkable grades and modest recommendation for standard infantry training, and then she could fade back into comfortable anonymity for another month. Sarah Chen, Veltar's voice rang out clearly. Sarah began to stand, already mentally preparing her expression of humble gratitude for whatever minimal recognition they were about to give her. But something in the commandant's tone made her pause halfway to her feet. There was something different in his voice. Something that sounded almost like surprise? Veltar was staring at his datapad with an expression of confusion that was rapidly shifting toward something else. Something that looked uncomfortably close to recognition. He tapped the display several times, as if trying to confirm what he was seeing. Sarah Chen, he repeated, and this time his voice carried a note that made conversation stop throughout the amphitheater. Combat Efficiency Assessment, Classified. Strategic Value Assessment, Classified. Recommended Training Specialization. He paused, his pale blue skin seeming to lose some of its natural glow. Classified under Galactic Defense Directive 77 Alpha. A murmur ran through the assembled cadets. Directive 77 Alpha was something they had heard mentioned in hushed tones but never explained in detail. It dealt with information so sensitive that even discussing it required special clearance. But Veltar wasn't finished. His voice when he spoke again was carefully controlled, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension. Combat Designation, Operative Classification Active. Call Sign. The pause stretched out for several heartbeats. Sarah felt every eye in the amphitheater focused on her, but, for the first time since arriving at the academy, it wasn't because she was failing to meet expectations. The quality of attention had changed completely. Where before there had been dismissive curiosity, now there was something approaching apprehension. Call sign, Reaper. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Several students actually stood up from their seats, craning their necks to get a better look at the small human girl who was still frozen halfway between sitting and standing. Thraka's four massive hands were gripping the edge of her seat so tightly that the metal began to creak in protest. ZYXTH's compound eyes had contracted to pinpoints, a sign of extreme shock in his species. But it was the reaction of the faculty that really drove home the significance of what had just happened. Professor Krindake, the Vortak combat instructor who had been casually reviewing training schedules at the side of the amphitheater, had dropped his datapad entirely. The crash of the device hitting the floor rang out like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Assistant Instructor Lyria, a young Altarian known for her composure under pressure, was staring at Sarah with wide eyes and what looked suspiciously like fear. Even Commandant Veltar himself seemed to be struggling to process what his own datapad was telling him. The Reaper? The whisper came from somewhere in the back rows, but, in the absolute silence that had fallen over the amphitheater, it might as well have been shouted. The human reaper? But, she's just average, Sarah finished quietly, finally, completing her motion to stand. She looked around the amphitheater, taking in the expressions of shock, disbelief, and, in some cases, dawning recognition on the faces of her classmates. I know. That was rather the point. ZYXTH found his voice first, though it came out as more of a croak than his usual confident tone. You're not really Sarah Chen. Oh, I am absolutely Sarah Chen, she replied, and, for the first time since arriving at the academy, her voice carried a note of something other than quiet submission. Sarah Chen, age 19, born in New Shanghai on Earth Colony 7. Daughter of Michael and Lisa Chen, both civilian engineers. Graduated from standard education programs with entirely unremarkable grades. Applied to the academy through the normal civilian recruitment process. She paused, letting that information sink in before continuing. I'm also the operative designated Reaper, responsible for the pacification of the Zorthan Rebellion, the elimination of the Crimson Fleet pirate organization, and the successful conclusion of the border wars through strategic application of targeted psychological warfare. The silence that followed this statement was so complete that Sarah could hear the distant hum of the Academy's fusion reactors. She had never spoken this many words consecutively in front of her classmates before, and the effect was clearly having the intended impact. Thraka's voice, when she finally managed to speak, was barely above a whisper. The Zorthan Rebellion was 17 different star systems. Billions of lives. The report said that entire enemy fleets surrendered without firing a shot because they were afraid of facing whoever was coming for them. They called in surrender before the coalition forces even arrived in system. Psychological warfare, Sarah confirmed with a slight nod. Much more efficient than actually destroying ships and killing people. Though I certainly could have done that too, if necessary. Professor Krinike, who had finally recovered enough to retrieve his dropped datapad, spoke up from the side of the amphitheater. The Crimson Fleet. They were the most successful pirate organization in galactic history. Thousands of ships, bases in 30 different systems, enough firepower to threaten major trade routes. And, according to the official reports, they simply vanished. One day they were raiding commercial shipping, the next day they were gone. No battles, no last stands, just gone. They chose early retirement, Sarah said with what might have been the ghost of a smile. I may have helped them make that decision. Commandant Veltar, who had been reviewing his datapad with increasingly wide eyes, looked up sharply. The border wars. That conflict was projected to last at least 5 years with conventional military action. Instead, it ended in 18 months with minimal casualties on both sides. The final reports are still classified, but preliminary analysis suggested that the enemy forces suffered some kind of massive breakdown in command and control structure that led to wholesale surrenders across 3 entire star clusters. 18 months was honestly longer than I expected it to take, Sarah admitted, settling back into her seat as if they were discussing homework assignments rather than military campaigns that had reshaped the galactic balance of power. But the Caliph Federation had some surprisingly creative defensive strategies. I had to improvise a bit. As the implications of what they were hearing began to sink in, students throughout the amphitheater began looking at Sarah with new eyes. The quiet girl who sat in the back of the class and barely spoke above a whisper wasn't some diversity admission who had gotten lucky. She was quite possibly the most dangerous individual in the academy. In the entire star system, for that matter. Alex Brightspear, the Altarian pilot candidate who had been called before Sarah, turned in her seat to stare with open amazement. But, you're terrible at combat simulations. I've seen you in training. You can barely hold a plasma rifle steady, and your tactical response times are below average for humans, let alone compared to the rest of us. Simulation parameters are designed to test conventional combat responses, Sarah explained patiently. I don't use conventional combat responses. In actual field operations, I don't typically carry weapons, and I certainly don't engage in direct confrontation. That would be counterproductive. But, how? The question came from Koreth Bloodfang, the Drakarian whose own combat scores were considered exceptional. How does someone who can't pass a basic marksmanship test end wars? Sarah considered the question for a moment, as if debating how much to reveal. Tell me, Korath, what's the most effective way to win a battle? The Dracarian's reptilian features scrunched up in confusion. Superior firepower? Better tactics? Higher training? All reasonable answers for conventional warfare, Sarah agreed. But, the most effective way to win a battle is to make sure it never happens in the first place. And, the most effective way to do that is to convince your enemies that fighting you would be the worst possible decision they could ever make. ZYXTH's compound eyes were still contracted in shock, but his tactical training was beginning to reassert itself. Psychological warfare. You're talking about fear as a weapon. Fear is one tool, Sarah confirmed. But it's not the only one, and it's not always the most effective. Sometimes confusion works better. Sometimes misdirection. Sometimes you just need to give people a face-saving way to back down from a fight they never really wanted in the first place. She gestured vaguely toward the rest of the amphitheater. For instance, how many of you have spent the last 3 months thinking that humans were weak? That Earth's admission to the coalition was some kind of charity case because our species couldn't possibly match the combat prowess of the established galactic powers? The uncomfortable silence that followed was answer enough. And, how many of your governments are probably operating under similar assumptions right now? How many strategic planning sessions include Earth as a minor factor to be dismissed or ignored? Thraka's massive hands were still gripping the edge of her seat, but her voice when she spoke was thoughtful rather than shocked. You're an intelligence operation. The whole thing. Not just you being here, but Earth's entire approach to joining the coalition. You're gathering information while making everyone think humanity isn't a threat. I'm a student at the Galactic Defense Academy, Sarah said mildly. Just like all of you. I'm here to learn about military tactics and strategic planning and how different species approach problems of galactic security. The fact that I might also be observing how coalition members think and plan and what their assumptions are about human capabilities, well, that's just good academic practice, isn't it? Commandant Veltar had been silent for several minutes, but now he stepped forward, his expression grave. Cadet Shen, or should I say, Operative Reaper, your presence here creates a significant security concern. If what you're saying is true, then Earth has effectively infiltrated our primary military training facility. Has it? Sarah asked, tilting her head slightly. I applied through normal channels, submitted all the required documentation, passed the entrance examinations, and have been attending classes regularly. My academic performance has been adequate, if unremarkable. In what way am I infiltrating anything? You're here under false pretenses, Professor Krinte K rumbled from the side of the amphitheater. You've been concealing your true identity and capabilities. I've been concealing some of my capabilities, Sarah corrected. My identity has been completely honest from day one. Sarah Chen, human, from Earth Colony 7. Everything I told you about my background is accurate. I just didn't mention that I also happen to have some additional job experience that wasn't directly relevant to my academic pursuits. She paused, then added with a slight smile, besides, Professor, how many of your students do you think have told you about every single thing they've ever done in their lives? Should ZYXTH have mentioned that he once crashed a civilian transport during an unauthorized joyride? Should Thraka have disclosed that she was expelled from her first military academy for fighting? Should Alex have mentioned that her admission here was dependent on her family making a substantial donation to the Academy's Starfighter training program? The fact that all 3 students she had mentioned immediately looked uncomfortable suggested that her information was accurate, which raised some interesting questions about how she had come by it. The point, Sarah continued, is that everyone here has aspects of their background that they haven't shared. The only difference is that my undisclosed experience happens to be militarily relevant. Veltar was reviewing his data pad again, and his expression was growing more concerned by the moment. According to these records, your combat effectiveness ratings are classified at levels that require council authorization to view. Your psychological profile includes warnings that are flagged for senior command staff only. And your actual mission parameters here are listed as. He trailed off, his pale blue skin going even paler. They're listed as active and ongoing, under the direct authority of Earth's Coalition Command. Well, Sarah said, settling back in her seat with the air of someone who had just finished explaining a particularly complex homework problem, I suppose that answers the question of whether this was going to stay secret much longer. The amphitheater erupted into chaos. The chaos that erupted in the amphitheater was unlike anything the Galactic Defense Academy had seen in its 200 years of operation. Students were on their feet, shouting questions in a dozen different languages. Several of the more aggressive species had moved closer to Sarah's section, though whether out of curiosity or perceived threat was unclear. The faculty members were frantically consulting their datapads and trying to establish communication with the Academy's security office. Through it all, Sarah Chen sat calmly in her seat, watching the mayhem unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a particularly complex scientific experiment. She had expected this reaction, had in fact been quietly preparing for it for months. What she hadn't expected was how strangely liberating it felt to finally drop the pretense. Commandant Veltar's voice cut through the noise with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Silence. The amphitheater gradually quieted, though the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. Every eye was focused either on the commandant or on the small human girl who had just turned their understanding of galactic politics upside down. Cadet Chen, Veltar said, his voice carefully controlled, I think it would be best if you accompanied me to my office immediately. There are questions that need to be answered, and protocols that must be followed. Of course, Commandant, Sarah replied, standing smoothly. Though I should mention that as of approximately 30 seconds ago, my communication implant received an activation signal. I believe you'll find that your office communications are about to become quite busy. As if summoned by her words, Veltar's personal datapad began chiming with the distinctive tone reserved for priority communications from Coalition High Command. His expression shifted from concern to something approaching alarm as he glanced at the incoming message indicators. How did you? He began, then stopped himself. Never mind. Yes, we need to discuss this immediately. He turned to address the assembled students, who were still staring at Sarah with expressions ranging from awe to suspicion. All cadets are to return to your quarters immediately. Classes are suspended pending further notice. Anyone caught discussing this morning's events outside of your immediate dormitory groups will face disciplinary action. As the students began to file out, Sarah could hear fragments of conversation in various languages, most of which seemed to center around variations of "did you know?" and "how is that possible?" She noticed that several of her classmates were giving her a notably wider berth than usual as they passed her row. Thraka Ironarm paused as she reached Sarah's section, her massive frame casting a shadow over the smaller human. Chen, she said, her deep voice unusually quiet, for what it's worth, I never thought you were weak. Weak people don't last 3 months in this place, no matter how low their test scores are. Sarah looked up at the towering Vorthak with genuine surprise. Thank you, Thraka. That actually means more than you might think. The big warrior nodded once, then continued toward the exit with the rest of her classmates. Sarah noticed that several other students had overheard the exchange, and the quality of their stares had shifted slightly. Still shocked, still uncertain, but perhaps a little less hostile. ZYXTH was the last to leave their section, his iridescent scales shifting through patterns of blue and green that Sarah had learned indicated deep thought in his species. He stopped directly in front of her, his compound eyes studying her with an intensity she had never seen from him before. The unauthorized joyride, he said quietly. I never told anyone about that. The records were sealed by my family's legal team. How did you know? Sarah considered her answer carefully. ZYXTH, in the 3 months I've been here, how many times have you spoken to me? He thought for a moment. Perhaps a dozen times. Usually to make jokes about human weakness. And, in those dozen conversations, how much do you think you learned about who I really am? The Krillian noble was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. You've been watching us. All of us. Learning about us while we ignored you. I've been doing my homework, Sarah confirmed. It's what I do. ZYXTH nodded slowly, then surprised her by executing a formal bow, a gesture of respect typically reserved for acknowledged superiors in Krillian culture. I think I owe you an apology, Sarah Chen. Several apologies, in fact. No apology necessary, she replied. You treated me exactly the way I wanted to be treated. Though perhaps in the future, you might want to remember that underestimating people can be dangerous. As ZYXTH left with the last of the students, Sarah found herself alone in the amphitheater with Veltar and the remaining faculty members, who were clustered together in hushed conversation near the podium. Their body language suggested they were dealing with a situation well outside their normal experience. Cadet Chen, Veltar called, if you would please join us? Sarah made her way down to the front of the amphitheater, noting how the faculty members unconsciously shifted position as she approached. Not backing away, exactly, but creating more space than they had maintained just minutes before. Professor Krintake, in particular, was watching her with the wary attention of a predator recognizing another predator. I believe introductions are in order, Veltar said as Sarah approached the group. This is Professor Krintake, our combat instruction specialist. Assistant Instructor Lyria handles tactical analysis. Professor Dexton oversees our strategic planning curriculum. And Professor Elon leads our xenopsychology studies. Sarah nodded politely to each of them in turn. Professors. I'm familiar with all of your work, of course. Professor Krintake's treatise on multi-species combat integration has been very influential in current coalition military doctrine. Assistant Instructor Lyria's algorithms for resource allocation during extended campaigns are being used throughout the fleet. Professor Dexton's analysis of the hegemony wars is still considered the definitive strategic overview of that conflict. She paused at Professor Elon, an elderly Zelani whose pale features seemed even more colorless than usual. And, Professor, your research into interspecies communication and cultural psychology has been particularly educational. There was something in the way she said educational that made Professor Elon straighten slightly. Have we met before, Cadet? Not formally, Sarah replied. But I've read all of your published papers on xenopsychological warfare applications. Very insightful work. Especially your theories on exploiting cultural blind spots for strategic advantage. The uncomfortable silence that followed this comment was broken by Veltar's data pad chiming again with another priority communication. He glanced at it and his expression grew even more grave. It seems that Coalition High Command is taking a rather urgent interest in our conversation, he said. Cadet Chen, I'm going to ask you directly, what exactly is your mission here? Sarah considered the question for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Commandant, how much do you know about Earth's integration into the Coalition? The standard information available to senior faculty, Veltar replied cautiously. Earth petitioned for membership 18 months ago. Your species was evaluated and accepted based on technological capabilities and strategic location. A relatively straightforward admission process. And what was your impression of humanity's military capabilities during that evaluation process? Professor Krintake answered before Veltar could respond. Frankly? Underwhelming. Humans appeared to have adequate defensive technologies and reasonable industrial capacity, but your species' approach to warfare seemed primitive compared to established coalition members. More enthusiasm than skill. You're not wrong, Sarah acknowledged. Human military doctrine as presented to the Coalition Evaluation Committee was indeed quite primitive. We made sure of that. Assistant Instructor Lyria leaned forward, her tactical mind engaging with the implications. You deliberately misrepresented your capabilities during the admission process. We represented our capabilities exactly as we wanted them to be perceived, Sarah corrected. There's a significant difference. Tell me, what assumptions have coalition strategic planners made about Earth's role in galactic defense? Professor Dexton, who specialized in strategic analysis, answered thoughtfully. Earth has been classified as a secondary support member. Adequate for supply chain management and technological support, but not suitable for frontline military operations. Human forces are expected to serve in auxiliary roles under the command of more experienced coalition species. Sarah nodded. And how much of coalition strategic planning has been shared with Earth representatives during integration meetings? The uncomfortable expressions that crossed the faculty members' faces suggested that the answer was quite a lot. It was standard practice to share operational details with new member species as part of their integration process, particularly those classified as support members who would need to coordinate their efforts with frontline forces. "Oh," Veltar said quietly, as the full implications began to sink in. "Oh, this is very bad." "From whose perspective?" Sarah asked with genuine curiosity. Admittedly, Earth now has detailed intelligence on coalition military capabilities, strategic planning processes, and defensive preparations. We know the locations of key installations, supply routes, communication networks, and command structures. We've identified the personality profiles of senior commanders, the political dynamics between member species, and the economic factors that drive military decisions. She paused, letting this information settle before continuing. "But, we're coalition members now. Why would any of that be a problem?" Professor Elon, who had been silent throughout most of the exchange, spoke up with a voice that was carefully controlled. "Because it means that if Earth ever decided to withdraw from the coalition, or if there was ever a conflict of interest between human goals and coalition goals, you would have every tool necessary to neutralize the galaxy's primary defensive organization." "That's a very pessimistic way of looking at it," Sarah replied. "Another perspective might be that Earth now has every tool necessary to defend the coalition more effectively against external threats. After all, you can't protect something if you don't understand how it works." Veltar's data pad chimed again, and, this time when he looked at it, his pale blue features went almost white. "Sarah Chen," he said, reading from the display, "I'm instructed to inform you that your operational status has been upgraded to Active Response Authority. Furthermore, I am to place myself and this facility under your direction pending the arrival of a Coalition Council Emergency Review Committee." The silence that followed this statement was profound. In the Academy's 200-year history, no student had ever been placed in command of the institution. The very concept was so far outside normal protocols that none of the faculty members seemed to know how to respond. "Well," Sarah said, clasping her hands behind her back in a gesture that somehow transformed her from a slight 19-year-old girl into something that looked remarkably like a senior military officer, "I suppose we should prepare for visitors. Commandant Veltar, I'll need access to your secure communication facilities. Professor Krintake, please begin an immediate review of Academy security protocols. Assistant Instructor Lyria, I want a complete analysis of current student populations, with particular attention to anyone who might have connections to non-coalition political organizations." She turned to the remaining faculty members. "Professor Dexton, please compile a summary of all strategic information that has been discussed in classes over the past 6 months. Professor Elon, I'll need your assessment of potential psychological impact on the student body from today's revelations." The faculty members exchanged glances, clearly struggling with the surreal nature of taking orders from someone who had been sitting in their classes as an unremarkable student just an hour earlier. "Begging your pardon," Professor Krintake said carefully, "but, are you actually qualified to command a facility of this importance?" Sarah's smile was polite but, somehow not entirely reassuring. "Professor, I've successfully concluded military operations involving the surrender of multiple star systems without firing a shot. I think I can manage a school." As if to punctuate her statement, the Academy's emergency communication system activated throughout the building, broadcasting a message that would fundamentally change how every species in the galaxy thought about humanity. "Attention all personnel. The Academy is now operating under enhanced security protocols. All academic activities are suspended pending review. This directive is issued under the authority of Earth Coalition Command, Operational Designation Reaper." The age of underestimating humanity was officially over. The Coalition Council emergency transport arrived at Valoris Prime exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes after Sarah Chen's identity had been revealed, setting what was almost certainly a new speed record for emergency diplomatic response. The sleek vessel, bearing the insignia of all 47 Coalition member species, settled onto the Academy's primary landing platform with the kind of precision that suggested its pilot was either exceptionally skilled or exceptionally motivated. Sarah watched the landing from the observation deck of Commandant Veltar's office, having spent the intervening hours reviewing Academy records and coordinating what she euphemistically called information management protocols. The transformation in her demeanor over those few hours had been remarkable to witness. Gone entirely was any trace of the quiet, uncertain student who had struggled with basic tactical assessments. In her place stood someone who moved and spoke with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the fates of star systems. The council delegation includes representatives from 12 species, she noted, reading from a datapad as the transport's loading ramp lowered. Primarily senior diplomatic staff, though I noticed they've brought General Tari of the Hegemony Defense Corps and Admiral Velnara from the Krillian Royal Fleet. Interesting choices. Commandant Veltar, who had spent the afternoon coming to terms with the fact that his academy was now effectively under the command of a 19-year-old human, looked up from his own preparations. General Tari is known for her direct approach to problem-solving. Admiral Velnara has extensive experience in intelligence operations. They're bringing military leadership, not just diplomats. They're bringing the kind of people who make decisions about potential threats, Sarah corrected mildly. The question is whether they see Earth as a threat to be contained or an asset to be properly utilized. Professor Elon, who had been working on her assigned psychological impact assessment, glanced up from her analysis. Given what we've learned about human strategic capabilities today, I would think the answer to that question depends largely on what you tell them. Sarah turned from the observation window, and, for a moment, her expression was unreadable. Professor, what I tell them is going to depend largely on what they're prepared to hear. And, more importantly, what they're prepared to do with the information. The delegation from the transport was making its way toward the Academy's main building, and, even from a distance, their body language suggested they were not here for a routine consultation. The Vortak general's massive stride spoke of barely contained aggression, while the Krillian admiral's movements had the fluid precision of someone prepared for immediate action. Commandant, Sarah said, settling into one of the office chairs with an ease that made it clear she had already mentally shifted from student to commander, I think it would be best if you conducted the initial meeting according to standard diplomatic protocols. I'll observe from the secondary conference room until you determine what kind of conversation they actually want to have. Veltar nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the arrangement. And, if they demand to speak with you directly? Then, we'll see how diplomatically they ask, Sarah replied with a slight smile. The main conference room of the Galactic Defense Academy was designed to impress. Holographic displays showed real-time tactical information from across Coalition space, while the polished table could accommodate representatives from all member species in comfortable arrangements suited to their various physiologies. Under normal circumstances, it was used for routine academic briefings and ceremonial events. These were not normal circumstances. General Taria's forearms were crossed in a gesture that clearly conveyed her displeasure as Commandant Veltar entered the conference room with his faculty members. The Vortak general stood nearly 9 feet tall, with the kind of presence that made even experienced military officers reassess their career choices. Her species had been the backbone of coalition military power for over 3 centuries, and she carried that authority like a visible aura. Commandant, she rumbled without preamble, we are here because one of your students appears to have compromised galactic security on a scale that we are still attempting to assess. I trust you have a comprehensive explanation prepared. Veltar took his position at the head of the table, though Taria's towering presence made it clear who was actually in charge of the room. General, the situation is admittedly complex. We only became aware of Cadet Chen's additional background this morning during routine roll call procedures. Admiral Velnara, whose iridescent scales showed the deep blue patterns that indicated intense focus in Krillian body language, leaned forward slightly. Commandant, let me be precise about what we know. Earth submitted detailed military assessments during their coalition admission process. Those assessments indicated technological competence but limited strategic capabilities. Based on that information, Earth was granted access to coalition strategic databases, defensive planning protocols, and operational intelligence networks. She paused, her compound eyes reflecting the conference room's lighting in patterns that were almost hypnotic. What we discovered today is that those assessments were apparently fiction. Earth has been operating military assets with capabilities that exceed many established coalition members. This represents either the most significant intelligence failure in galactic history, or the most successful intelligence operation in galactic history. Professor Dexton, who had been reviewing strategic information as Sarah had requested, spoke up hesitantly. Admiral, if I may, the individual in question has been attending classes normally for 3 months. Her academic performance has been adequate but unremarkable. If this is an intelligence operation, it's not particularly sophisticated. General Tari's laugh was more of a growl than an expression of amusement. Professor, the individual in question is credited with ending 3 major military conflicts through what intelligence reports describe as strategic application of psychological warfare. The fact that she convinced an entire academy that she was an unremarkable student while gathering intelligence on coalition operations suggests that her methods are more sophisticated than you might think. From the secondary conference room, Sarah was watching the proceedings through the academy's internal monitoring system with considerable interest. The delegation's approach was exactly what she had expected: aggressive posturing combined with demands for information they weren't yet prepared to process. It was, she reflected, very much like watching a group of people try to solve a puzzle when they were still arguing about what the picture was supposed to show. Her communication implant chimed softly with an incoming message from Earth Command: Reaper, you are authorized to disclose Level 3 operational parameters if necessary to maintain coalition stability. Full disclosure authority pending Council determination of threat assessment. Sarah smiled slightly as she read the message. Earth Command was giving her considerable latitude in how to handle the situation, which meant they trusted her judgment about what the coalition was ready to know. The question was whether the coalition delegation was prepared to have their assumptions challenged quite as thoroughly as she was planning to challenge them. In the main conference room, the conversation was beginning to take on the tone of an interrogation rather than a diplomatic consultation. Diplomat Yareth of the Eltarian Republic, whose silver hair seemed to glow with inner light that reflected her species' emotional state, was reviewing information on her datapad with increasing concern. Commandant Veltar, she said, her melodious voice carrying undertones of distress, the operational reports we've received regarding this Reaper designation are disturbing. The Zorthan rebellion involved 15 star systems and approximately 40 billion inhabitants. The conflict was resolved when entire enemy fleets surrendered without engagement. How does one individual accomplish something like that? Veltar glanced toward the secondary conference room, knowing that Sarah was monitoring the conversation. Diplomat Yareth, I think that's a question that requires a more direct source. Then, perhaps, General Tari rumbled, it's time we spoke with this individual directly. As if summoned by the statement, Sarah Chen stepped into the main conference room. The effect of her entrance was immediate and noticeable. Despite her small stature and youthful appearance, something about her presence seemed to change the entire dynamic of the room. Perhaps it was the way she moved with quiet confidence, or the fact that she met each of the delegation members' eyes with steady regard, or simply the knowledge of what she was capable of. Whatever the reason, the aggressive posturing that had characterized the beginning of the meeting shifted noticeably towards something more respectful. General Tari, Sarah said, offering a slight bow that was perfectly calibrated to show respect without deference. Admiral Valnara, Diplomat Yareth. Thank you for coming so quickly. I apologize for the inconvenience, but I suspect this conversation was inevitable once my identity became known. She took a seat at the conference table, somehow managing to look perfectly at ease despite being surrounded by some of the most powerful military and diplomatic figures in the galaxy. I understand you have questions about Earth's capabilities and intentions. I'm prepared to provide answers, though I should mention that the scope of what I can discuss will depend on how this conversation proceeds. General Taria's forearms uncrossed slightly, a gesture that suggested she was recalibrating her approach. Let's start with something simple. Are you actually a student at this academy, or is your presence here entirely an intelligence operation? I am absolutely a student at this academy, Sarah replied without hesitation. I applied through normal channels, passed the entrance examinations, and have been attending classes regularly. My academic transcripts are authentic, my test scores are accurate, and my dormitory assignment is genuine. I am here to learn. Admiral Valnara's scale shifted through patterns of deep blue and green as she processed this information. But, you're also gathering intelligence on coalition operations. I'm observing how coalition members approach strategic problems, Sarah acknowledged. It's difficult to study military tactics and strategic planning without learning about the organizations that employ those tactics. But, then, every student here is doing the same thing. The only difference is that Earth Command finds my observations useful. Diplomat Yareth leaned forward, her silver hair shifting through patterns of light that indicated deep concern. Sarah-chan, your operational records indicate that you have ended multiple wars single-handedly. How is that possible? What capabilities do humans possess that we weren't informed about? Sarah was quiet for a moment, as if considering how much to reveal. Diplomat Yareth, may I ask you a question first? When your species evaluates potential threats, what factors do you consider most important? The Altarian diplomat seemed surprised by the question, but answered thoughtfully. Military capacity, technological capabilities, economic resources, strategic positioning. Standard threat assessment parameters. All very logical, Sarah agreed. Now let me ask you this, how do you assess the threat level of something that doesn't want to fight you? The silence that followed this question was thoughtful rather than uncomfortable. Several of the delegation members exchanged glances as they processed the implications. General Tari was the first to respond. Are you suggesting that human military strategy is based on conflict avoidance? I'm suggesting that human military strategy is based on achieving objectives with minimal resource expenditure, Sarah clarified. Fighting is expensive, time-consuming, and unpredictable. If you can accomplish your goals without fighting, why wouldn't you? She activated the conference room's holographic display, showing a star map of the former Zorthan Rebellion territory. The Zorthan Rebellion controlled 17 star systems with a combined military force of approximately 3,000 warships. Conventional military action to pacify the territory would have required a coalition force of at least 10,000 ships, taken 2 to 3 years, and resulted in millions of casualties. The display shifted to show tactical analysis data. Instead, Earth Command sent me with a single courier ship and instructions to resolve the situation with minimal coalition involvement. Total time required, 4 months. Total casualties, 0. Total cost to coalition resources, essentially nothing. Admiral Valnara's compound eyes had contracted to focus points. How? Sarah's smile was slight but somehow unsettling. Admiral, what would you do if you received verified intelligence that an enemy force was approaching your territory with capabilities you couldn't match, strategies you couldn't counter, and weapons you didn't understand? Attempt to negotiate, the Admiral replied without hesitation. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. The Zorthan Rebellion received intelligence indicating that the coalition was deploying a new type of military asset against them. Something that could appear anywhere in their territory without warning, could neutralize their command structures without engaging their fleets, and had already successfully infiltrated their most secure facilities. She paused, letting the implications settle. None of that intelligence was false, incidentally. I did appear in their territory without warning, I did neutralize their command structures, and I had infiltrated their most secure facilities. The only thing I didn't mention was that I did all of it by walking in through the front door and having conversations with people. General Taria's massive frame seemed to settle back slightly as she processed this information. Psychological warfare. You convinced them they were facing an enemy they couldn't defeat. I convinced them they were facing an enemy they didn't need to defeat, Sarah corrected. The Zorthan Rebellion started because the planetary governments felt that the coalition wasn't responding adequately to their economic and political concerns. So I gave them a face-saving way to address those concerns without continued military action. She gestured to the holographic display again. The rebellion ended when I facilitated direct negotiations between Zorthan leadership and coalition representatives, with terms that addressed the underlying grievances while maintaining coalition authority in the region. Everyone got what they actually wanted, and nobody had to die for it. Diplomat Yaretha's hair patterns had shifted to a warm golden tone that indicated growing understanding. And the Crimson Fleet? Similar approach, different implementation, Sarah acknowledged. Pirates operate on the assumption that raiding is more profitable than legitimate trade. I convinced them that assumption was incorrect by demonstrating that their operational security had been completely compromised. When someone can appear on your flagship bridge during a planning meeting to discuss your retirement options, continued piracy stops being an attractive career choice. The room was quiet for several moments as the delegation processed what they were hearing. The methods Sarah was describing were unlike anything in standard coalition military doctrine, but the results spoke for themselves. Finally, General Tari asked the question that was clearly on everyone's mind: what does Earth want? Sarah's expression grew serious. General, Earth wants exactly what we said we wanted when we applied for coalition membership, to contribute to galactic security and peace through cooperation with established powers. The only difference is that we're capable of contributing more effectively than our initial assessments indicated. She stood, moving to the holographic display and calling up current intelligence reports. Admiral Velnara, according to Coalition intelligence, what is the current primary threat to galactic stability? The Admiral consulted her datapad. The Harbinger Alliance. Extragalactic forces that have been probing our outer territories for the past 18 months. Estimated force strength unknown, technological capabilities unknown, strategic intentions unknown. And, what is Coalition Command's current strategy for addressing this threat? Defensive positioning along suspected approach vectors, intelligence gathering operations to determine enemy capabilities, and preparation for potential large-scale military engagement, Admiral Velnara replied. Sarah nodded. All very reasonable responses to an unknown external threat. Now let me ask you this. What if the Harbinger Alliance could be convinced that military engagement with the Coalition would be counterproductive to their objectives? The silence that followed this question was electric. The delegation members were beginning to understand what Earth was actually offering. You're proposing to handle the Harbinger situation the way you handled the Zorthan rebellion, Diplomat Yareth said slowly. I'm proposing to determine whether the Harbinger situation can be resolved without a war that could devastate significant portions of the galaxy, Sarah corrected. If peaceful resolution is impossible, then conventional military action remains an option. But, if it is possible. She turned to face the delegation directly. The question is whether the Coalition is prepared to trust Earth Command to explore that possibility. The weight of that question settled over the room like a heavy blanket. What Sarah was proposing would fundamentally change humanity's role in galactic affairs, from junior support member to senior strategic partner. It would also mean placing the galaxy's fate in the hands of a species that had just demonstrated they were far more capable than anyone had realized. General Tari was the first to break the silence. What would you need? Sarah's smile was confident but not arrogant. Access to all available intelligence on Harbinger activities, full diplomatic authority to represent Coalition interests, and a very fast ship. She paused, then added with a slight grin that made her look her actual age for the first time since the meeting began, and probably a better academy grade in xenopsychology. Professor Elon, I think I'm going to need some tutoring. The age of underestimating humanity was over. The age of humanity leading the galaxy's defense was about to begin. 3 weeks after the emergency council meeting, Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the Coalition stealth cruiser Diplomatic Resolution, watching the sensor displays with the kind of focused attention that had become familiar to her new crew. The ship was humanity's contribution to the mission, a vessel that officially didn't exist, equipped with technologies that officially hadn't been developed, crewed by individuals whose service records were officially classified. Contact bearing 27 Mark 15, reported Lieutenant Commander Torres, the ship's human tactical officer. Single vessel, configuration consistent with Harbinger reconnaissance units observed in previous encounters. Captain Z.H. Kala, a veteran Altarian officer who had volunteered for the mission despite its uncertain prospects, studied the tactical display with concern. That's well inside Coalition territory. Closer than any previous Harbinger incursion. Their testing response times, Sarah observed, reviewing the sensor data on her personal display. This is the 4th probe this week, and each one has penetrated slightly deeper into Coalition space before withdrawing. They're mapping our defensive capabilities. She turned to the communications station, where Chief Petty Officer Mreth, a young Krillian specialist, was monitoring subspace traffic. Any response from Coalition patrol units? Defense Fleet Gamma is moving to intercept, Mreth reported. Estimated arrival time 37 minutes. More than enough time for the probe to complete its mission and withdraw, Sarah mused. Captain, how quickly can we reach intercept position? Z.H. Kala consulted her navigation display. 14 minutes at maximum stealth approach velocity. But, our orders were to observe and gather intelligence, not to engage. Our orders, Sarah corrected gently, were to make contact with Harbinger forces and attempt diplomatic resolution. This represents our first real opportunity to do that. The bridge was quiet for a moment as the implications settled. For 3 weeks, they had been tracking Harbinger movements through Coalition space, trying to establish patterns and identify opportunities for contact. The extragalactic forces had proven frustratingly elusive, appearing just long enough to conduct reconnaissance before disappearing into the void between galaxies. Communications, Sarah said, turning to Mreth, prepare a standard first contact package. Include universal mathematical principles, basic peaceful intentions declaration, and an invitation to dialogue. Standard coalition protocols. Preparing package now, Mreth acknowledged, her scales shifting through patterns of nervous concentration. Captain, Sarah continued, take us to intercept position. Best possible stealth approach, but be prepared to decloak if they attempt to withdraw. ZH-Kala nodded and began issuing orders to her crew. The diplomatic resolution had been designed for precisely this kind of mission, fast enough to catch most other vessels, stealthy enough to approach undetected, and equipped with enough firepower to defend itself if diplomacy failed. It was, Sarah reflected, a perfect metaphor for humanity's approach to galactic politics. As they approached the Harbinger probe, more details became visible on the sensor displays. The alien vessel was roughly cylindrical, approximately 300 meters long, with a hull that seemed to absorb most scanning attempts. Its propulsion system was unlike anything in Coalition databases, generating energy readings that suggested technology significantly in advance of galactic standard. Captain, Lieutenant Commander Torres reported, the probe has altered course. It's moving toward our position. Do they see us? ZH-Kala asked, checking her stealth system readings. Negative, Torres replied. Stealth systems are fully operational. But they're definitely coming this way. Sarah studied the tactical display with growing interest. They're not running. Every previous Harbinger contact has involved immediate withdrawal when Coalition forces approached. This one is actually moving toward a potential contact. She turned to the communications station. Mreth, are you detecting any active scanning from the probe? Affirmative, the Krillian officer replied. Very sophisticated sensor sweeps, but not focused on our position. They appear to be conducting a detailed analysis of local space, including the area where Defense Fleet Gamma will arrive, Sarah observed. They're not just mapping our territory, they're studying our response patterns. This is intelligence gathering on a strategic level. Captain ZH-Kala glanced at Sarah with an expression of concern. If they're analyzing our fleet responses, that suggests they're preparing for something more significant than reconnaissance. Or they're trying to understand our capabilities before deciding whether to initiate formal contact, Sarah countered. There's a significant difference between studying an enemy and studying a potential neighbor. The Harbinger probe was now less than 50,000 kilometers away, close enough for detailed scanning but still well outside any threatening range. Its movements were deliberate and unhurried, suggesting confidence rather than caution. Sarah, Captain ZH-Kala said, using the informal address that had developed during their weeks together, you're the expert on this kind of situation. What do you think they're actually doing? Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying not just the sensor readings but the implications behind them. Captain, think about this from their perspective. They're from outside our galaxy, which means they've traveled distances that most of our species consider impossible. They have technology that exceeds ours in several key areas, and they've been conducting reconnaissance for over a year without making any aggressive moves. She gestured toward the tactical display. If they wanted to attack us, they could have done it already. If they wanted to avoid us entirely, they wouldn't be conducting such obvious reconnaissance. The fact that they're here, studying us systematically, suggests they're trying to make a decision about something. What kind of decision? Torres asked from the tactical station. Whether we're worth talking to, Sarah replied. And whether we're likely to shoot first and ask questions later. As if responding to her analysis, the Harbinger probe suddenly slowed its approach and came to a complete stop relative to their position. For several moments, it simply hung in space, conducting what appeared to be intensive scanning operations. Then, it began transmitting. Captain, Mreth reported, her voice tight with excitement, we're receiving a structured communication from the probe. It's responding to our first contact package. What kind of response? ZH-Kala demanded. Mathematical confirmations of the universal principles we transmitted, Reth said, reviewing the incoming data. But, Captain, the mathematics they're sending back is significantly more advanced than what we included. They're not just acknowledging our message, they're demonstrating their understanding exceeds our presentation. Sarah felt a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. They're showing off. Classic first contact behavior, demonstrate superior capabilities while acknowledging peaceful intentions. Mreth, prepare a response package. Include acknowledgement of their mathematical superiority, but add some of our own advanced theoretical work. Let's see how much they actually know. What kind of theoretical work? The communications officer asked. Quantum consciousness interface theory, multidimensional energy manipulation, and. Sarah paused, considering. Add some of Professor Elon's xenopsychological frameworks. If they're as advanced as they appear to be, they might find our understanding of interspecies psychology interesting. As Mreth prepared the response package, Lieutenant Commander Torres was monitoring the probe's movements with growing concern. Captain, Defense Fleet Gamma will arrive in 16 minutes. If the Harbinger vessel maintains its current position, there's going to be a confrontation. Not necessarily, Sarah said, reviewing the communication patterns on her display. Mreth, include a note in our response package about the approaching coalition fleet. Make it clear that they're following standard defensive protocols, not mounting an attack. Done, Mreth confirmed. Transmitting now. The response from the Harbinger probe was almost immediate. Instead of the mathematical exchanges that had characterized their previous communication, this time they received what appeared to be a complex multidimensional map. Captain, Mreth said, her scale shifting through patterns of amazement, this appears to be a representation of local galactic space, but it includes dimensional layers that our standard sensors can't detect. And, Captain, it shows the exact positions of all coalition fleet units in this sector. The implications were staggering. The Harbingers weren't just studying coalition territories, they had scanning capabilities that could penetrate coalition stealth technology and track fleet movements across vast distances. If they wanted to launch a surprise attack, they had all the information they needed. They're sharing intelligence with us, Sarah realized. This isn't a threat demonstration, it's a confidence-building measure. They're showing us that they could attack if they wanted to, but they're choosing to share information instead. Captain ZH Kala was studying the tactical implications of what they were seeing. Sarah, if this intelligence is accurate, it means they've been tracking coalition fleet movements for months without our knowledge. Every defensive position, every patrol route, every strategic formation. And they're telling us about it, Sarah pointed out. Captain, prepare a response acknowledging their intelligence and requesting direct communication. Real-time exchange, not just data packages. Are you sure that's wise? ZH Kala asked. We don't know anything about their intentions. We know they'd had the capability to attack us for months and haven't used it, Sarah replied. We know they're willing to share strategic intelligence rather than exploit it. And we know they're sophisticated enough to understand xenopsychological frameworks. Those are all positive indicators for peaceful contact. Before ZH Kala could respond, the Harbinger probe transmitted another data package, this one containing what appeared to be a real-time video communication request. Captain, Mreth reported, they're requesting direct visual contact. Standard first contact protocols for establishing real-time dialogue. Sarah stood from her position at the analysis station and moved toward the main display screen. Accept the communication request, Mreth. Let's see who we're talking to. The main screen flickered as the communication link established, and, for the first time in galactic history, humans looked upon a representative of the Harbinger Alliance. The being that appeared on screen was unlike any species in Coalition databases. Humanoid in basic configuration but taller and more slender than most galactic species, with skin that seemed to shift through subtle patterns of color and light. Most striking were its eyes, large, multifaceted organs that suggested visual capabilities far beyond standard biological norms. When it spoke, its voice was transmitted in perfect Coalition standard, suggesting either sophisticated translation capabilities or extensive prior study of galactic languages. Greetings, representatives of the Coalition, the being said, its tone carrying harmonics that suggested complex emotional undertones. I am designated speaker for this interaction. We have been observing your civilization for some time, and we find ourselves curious. Greetings, Speaker, Sarah replied, stepping forward to represent the coalition in this historic moment. I am Sarah Chen, representing Earth Command and the Galactic Defense Coalition. We are honored by this contact and share your curiosity about potential relations between our peoples. The speaker's multifaceted eyes seemed to focus directly on her, and, for a moment, Sarah had the distinct impression that she was being evaluated on levels she couldn't fully comprehend. Sarah Chen, the speaker said, and something in its tone suggested recognition. The individual designated Reaper in your military communications. We have observed the outcomes of your interventions in various conflicts. Your methods are unconventional by the standards we have observed in this galaxy. Sarah felt a slight chill at the realization that the Harbingers had been watching coalition affairs closely enough to identify individual military personnel. Speaker, may I ask how long your people have been observing our galaxy? Time measurements are relative across galactic distances, the speaker replied. But, in your terms, we have maintained observation posts at the edge of your galaxy for approximately 100 of your standard years. We have been studying your various civilizations to determine their potential for peaceful coexistence. Captain ZH Kala stepped forward, her diplomatic training engaging. Speaker, the coalition would be honored to establish formal relations with your people. Perhaps we could arrange for more comprehensive discussions at a neutral location? The speaker's attention shifted to the captain, and again Sarah sensed evaluation taking place. Captain ZH Kala of the Altarian Republic. Your service record indicates significant experience in diplomatic contact situations. However, we believe this particular discussion requires someone with different qualifications. Its multifaceted eyes returned to Sarah. Sarah Chen, would you be willing to accompany our representative to a location where more detailed discussions could take place? We find your approach to conflict resolution compatible with our own philosophical frameworks. Sarah glanced at Captain ZH Kala, who nodded slightly, then looked back at the speaker. I would be honored to participate in such discussions. However, I should note that any formal agreements would require approval from coalition leadership. Naturally, the speaker agreed. We seek understanding, not hasty commitments. We will transmit coordinates for a meeting location. Please bring whatever support personnel you require for your comfort and security. The communication link ended, leaving the bridge of the diplomatic resolution in thoughtful silence. Well, Captain ZH Kala said finally, I suppose we should contact Coalition Command and inform them that first contact has been achieved. Sarah was already reviewing the coordinate information that had been transmitted. The meeting location was in neutral space, equidistant between Coalition territory and the galactic edge. Far enough from major populations to avoid complications, close enough to allow for reasonable travel times. Captain, she said, I think we're going to need a bigger ship. 6 months after first contact with the Harbinger Alliance, Sarah Chen stood in what had once been Conference Room 7 of the Galactic Defense Academy and was now the temporary headquarters of the Intergalactic Relations Council. The room had been extensively modified to accommodate not just the various coalition species, but also the Harbinger's unique physiological requirements and their preference for multidimensional data displays. The negotiations had been unlike anything in galactic history. The Harbingers, as it turned out, represented not a single species but a coalition of 43 different civilizations from 3 separate galaxies, united by what they called the convergence principle, the belief that advanced civilizations had a responsibility to foster peaceful development rather than compete for resources through warfare. The mineral rights agreements for the Outer Rim sectors are finalized, reported Ambassador Taith, a Vortak diplomat who had initially been skeptical of the entire process. The Harbingers get access to resources that are difficult for us to extract, we get access to their processing technologies. Both sides benefit significantly. Sarah nodded, reviewing the data on her holographic display. The past 6 months had fundamentally transformed galactic economics, politics, and military strategy. The Harbingers possessed technologies that were centuries ahead of Coalition standard in some areas, while Coalition species had developed solutions to problems the Harbingers had never encountered. The result was a complex web of mutually beneficial exchanges that were making all parties more prosperous and secure. What about the joint research initiative, she asked, turning to Dr. Elon, who had been promoted to chief xenopsychologist for the new council. "Remarkable progress," the elderly Zelani replied, her pale features bright with enthusiasm. "The Harbinger's understanding of consciousness and neural networks is complementing our research into interspecies psychology beautifully. We're developing communication protocols that could eventually allow direct mind-to-mind contact between different species." From his position at the Tactical Analysis Station, General Taria's voice rumbled with satisfaction. "The military cooperation agreements are exceeding all projections. Harbinger defensive technologies combined with coalition strategic planning are creating security capabilities that neither side could achieve independently." Sarah smiled as she listened to the reports. The transformation had been so complete that it was sometimes difficult to remember the fear and suspicion that had characterized the early days of contact. The Harbingers had proven to be exactly what they claimed, an alliance of advanced civilizations seeking to expand peaceful cooperation rather than territorial control. "Speaker Vexhan," Sarah said, addressing the Harbinger representative who was participating in the meeting through a quantum communication link, "how are your people adjusting to increased interaction with coalition species?" The speaker's multifaceted eyes shifted through patterns of what Sarah had learned indicated contentment. "The adaptation process continues to exceed expectations," Coordinator Chen. "Our younger generations are particularly enthusiastic about the cultural exchange programs. Several of our scholars have requested permanent assignment to coalition research facilities." Coordinator Chen. The title still felt strange, even after 3 months of officially holding it. The Intergalactic Relations Council had been created as a joint coalition Harbinger organization, with Sarah serving as the primary liaison between the two groups. It was a position that had never existed before, with responsibilities that were still being defined as situations arose. "There is one matter that requires discussion," Speaker Vexhan continued, its harmonic voice taking on undertones of concern. "Our long-range monitoring stations have detected evidence of activity from what you might call a fourth galactic civilization. The energy signatures suggest technology comparable to our own, but the movement patterns are concerning." The conference room grew quiet as the implications settled. The discovery of the Harbingers had already revolutionized galactic politics. The prospect of yet another advanced civilization was both exciting and potentially destabilizing. "What kind of concerning?" General Tari asked, her 4 massive arms crossing in a gesture that Sarah had learned indicated tactical assessment mode. "The movement patterns suggest resource acquisition rather than exploration," Speaker Vexhan replied. "Large-scale industrial operations in previously uninhabited systems, with what appears to be strip mining of entire planetary bodies. If these observations are accurate, we may be dealing with a civilization that prioritizes material accumulation over sustainable development." Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the shift from diplomatic coordination to strategic analysis that had characterized her entire career. "Speaker, how much time do we have before this civilization reaches either coalition or Harbinger territory?" "Based on current expansion rates, approximately 18 standard months before they reach the edge of your galactic space. Perhaps 30 months before they reach systems with significant populations." Dr. Elon leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Coordinator, this sounds remarkably similar to the situation that brought the Harbingers to our galaxy in the first place. They mentioned that they had encountered resource-focused civilizations before." "Indeed," Speaker Vexhan confirmed. "We have encountered 3 such civilizations during our expansion across multiple galaxies. In each case, peaceful coexistence proved challenging. Such civilizations tend to view other species as either resources to be exploited or obstacles to be removed." Sarah stood and began pacing, a habit she had developed during complex strategic planning sessions. The situation was familiar in its basic structure, an unknown threat approaching, with limited information and multiple possible responses. But the scale was unlike anything she had dealt with before. "What were the outcomes with the previous civilizations you encountered?" she asked. "Variable," Speaker Vexhan admitted. "In one case, we successfully negotiated territorial agreements that limited their expansion to uninhabited systems. In another, we were forced to establish defensive barriers that effectively contained them within a specific galactic region. The third case." The speaker paused, its harmonic voice taking on darker undertones. The third case required more direct intervention. The civilization in question had begun harvesting inhabited systems for biological resources. The convergence principle does not permit such activities to continue unchallenged. General Taria's expression had shifted to something approaching battle readiness. Speaker, are you saying you destroyed an entire civilization? We removed their capability to threaten other species, Speaker Vexhan clarified. Their technology was disabled, their expansion was halted, and they were relocated to a region where they could develop sustainably without impacting other civilizations. No individuals were harmed, but their society was restructured. The implications were staggering. The Harbingers possess not just advanced technology, but the capability and willingness to restructure entire civilizations when necessary. It was a level of power that made even coalition military capabilities seem insignificant by comparison. Coordinator, Ambassador Taith said, his deep voice thoughtful, "It seems to me that we have an opportunity to apply the same principles that worked so well with the Harbinger contact. Instead of waiting for this new civilization to arrive and, potentially cause problems, why not make contact first and attempt to establish peaceful relations?" Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face the assembled representatives. Ambassador Taith raises an excellent point. Speaker Vexhan, would the Harbinger Alliance be willing to participate in a joint contact mission? The convergence principle requires such participation, Speaker Vexhan replied. However, Coordinator Chen, we should note that this situation would require different approaches than our initial contact. This civilization appears to be actively expanding and resource